time Sri Lanka's ex-president turned to China for a loan for his ambitious port, China said yes. Yes, though feasibility studies disapproved. Yes, though frequent lenders like India had rejected the plan. Yes, though Sri Lanka's debt was already ballooning under Mr. Rajapaksa. When predictably, Sri Lanka's government struggled to repay the debt, they were forced to hand China the port for 99 years. From Ethiopia to Kazakhstan, where Chinese money was once celebrated, today protests erupt against these failed projects. We say it was just one road, then it's a dead end. What do we stand for? The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, refers to China's infrastructural projects throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa. This includes railways, bridges, and seaports to make two passages that give China direct access to 70 nations along the historic Silk Road as a part of Xi Jinping's grand strategy. What are the key characteristics of this? It is financed through billions in debt that is not conditional on economic or political reform. Debt that is funneled through Chinese state banks and China-run AIIB, making it subject to purely and exclusively Chinese oversight. These construction projects are also exclusively run by Chinese state-run firms with Chinese workers. If a loan isn't repaid, China will forgive a part of the debt in exchange for ownership of the infrastructure like we saw in Sri Lanka. What is the context of this debate? Over the last 5 years, China could have gone down two roads. They could have worked with existing systems of development using their increased influence in the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, the BRICS Bank to strengthen the systems of collaborative lending, or they could have gone it alone where the terms are dictated by their self-interest. We regret that China didn't take the first road and took the latter road. It's not that we think China is malicious, but that they are self-interested. And it makes sense for them to go do what gives them the most soft power. But this debate is about whether we, as the recipients of these projects and the world community, think that this created a net harm. We say yes. Three arguments. First, the Belt and Road Initiative is the road to economic harm to host nations. Two, the Belt and Road Initiative is the road to upsetting the international balance of power. And third, the BRI is the road to entrenching in liberal regimes. First, why is the BRI the road to economic harm for its recipient nations? These projects are funded through loans. Given how projects are run by Chinese corporations with Chinese workers, nations should have already been cautious about the debt. But the BRI targets small and economically vulnerable nations that are unable to reject Chinese loans when it comes with mounting pressure. They fear that non-participation will cause that the trade deals that China will have will be something that they lose out of, and that they will lose these generous Chinese aid. So when Beijing comes knocking on Mongolia's door and threatens to end their cooperation on tuberculosis in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Mongolia isn't really begging for the bridges that get built in their nation. When these nations take this debt, default is the most likely reality. Why? Because the speciality of Chinese loans is that they don't require economic reform. So the governments take on loans but don't rein in on spending and then struggle to repay them. Their infrastructure set up under the BRI also does not pay for itself because they are often white elephants, vanity projects of leaders that duplicate existing infrastructure. That's why when Prime Minister Rajapaksa builds a second Sri Lankan airport, which he names after himself with the money from the BRI, he saddled the country with debt and the world's emptiest airport. What are the consequences of this default? China could graciously forgive this debt and so generously take over the infrastructure, but it means they have control over ports, roads, and airports. In fact, this is the deliberate Chinese contingency plan, that in the worst case, they take back their sunk costs using your ports and your airports to dump their products into your country, and then they use those very resources to extract your natural resources and take it out through your ports. We've seen debt defaults in developed nations like Greece fracturing the spirit of the people and leaving people unemployed. Imagine this in Kenya. Crucially, default in the wake of an unfinished project is devastating to other countries in the BRI. You can't build a road from China to Egypt if Kenya in the middle defaults. That's why this would invalidate anyone's investment, because when one nation defaults, it puts the entire project at the risk of default. In the comparative, the alternative is borrowing from multilateral institutions like the Asian Development Bank, BRICS Bank, or the African Development Bank. Sure, China might have inflated the total amount of debt, but all debt isn't good debt. What does multilateral multilateral bed look like instead? No one country has exclusive power. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa each have the same equal share of 20% in the BRICS Bank. In the Asian Development Bank, the US and Japan account for 15%, while China, India, Canada, and Korea have the rest. Multilateral lenders each want their money back and use their power to check each other. So even if independently they are self-interested, together they can't design a system that cedes monopoly over infrastructure to one country. So default is mutual loss in such an investment for the investor and the host nation. So in each of them asking for their money back and in holding these nations accountable, they lend with sustainable preconditions. We regret the BRI for being a regime that is designed to prey on the most economically vulnerable nations. Second argument, why is the BRI the road to upsetting the international balance of power? BRI uniquely empowers a Chinese global hegemony before that, yes.
Oftentimes, the countries that utilize the BRI, like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, are connected together rather than simply being connected to China. This allows for intra-country trade on our side of the house. How would that have happened without the BRI?
This is a lie insofar as tariffs and quotas continue to remain the same between these nations. The unifying factor of the BRI is not that nations are linked with each other, but overwhelmingly linked with China. We regret that. The BRI uniquely empowers a Chinese global hegemony. If the projects are successful, it entrenches their military. The corridors are designed to allow Chinese troops to mobilize at the borders of any nation and scare them into submission. But remember, the project passes through territory that is undisputedly disputed, especially border areas like the China-Pakistan economic corridor that passes through Indian territory that's claimed by India. Right? When China is already incursing on this region, it's unacceptable. It allows them to force smaller countries into trade deals when the giant that you owe $1 billion to says, you can't join that trade deal, better join this free trade area. That's a choice that vulnerable nations can't make. Further, like we explained, the deliberate plan is to allow default and take over infrastructure. In such a world, China has unprecedented influence over global trade and over Western nations. Because if China controls major trade routes and hubs, controls Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and South Africa's hubs, then Nigeria, America, India, all of these regions are economically hurt at the point which they can hold that port as leverage and say, we will not allow you to access this. The BRI crowds out regional powers and regional cooperation. We see this when Philippines was pushing for ASEAN multilateralism, but then had to cede into the BRI. In a world without the BRI, the US, China, and regional superpowers check each other. China has trillions in US debt, participates in the BRICS Bank, and is committed to the UN 2030 agenda and in their speeches in the World Economic Forum, and even checks the US and international organizations when they took over the Paris Accords. Commensurately, the US has a naval fleet in the Southeast Asian region and has military deals with Japan and South Korea. Simultaneously, India, the African Union, all arise at the point which they have regional projects. The BRI created a glorious program so that Xi Jinping can build a legacy like that of Mao. But it leaves a global legacy of unilateralism and hegemony. We wish that China had taken the road less traveled by because it would have made all the difference. One road is a dead end.
Panel, for far too long has fear-mongering rhetoric from hypocritical countries kept a glass ceiling on the rise of China. The comparisons to perfection that prevent one of the most aspiring economic constructions in the past millennia has been shut down because Western countries can say China can't make the mistakes that we have already made in our past. We think ultimately that this is an aspiring deal that is able to empower the people who have been left in destitution because of the lack of support from any other alternatives. Because of that, we're very proud to oppose. What is our stance? We support China's model of peaceful rise through the Belt and Road Initiative, filling in the gap of the Western pullout that we see all across the globe, continuing the 2,000-year-old system of tribunes and the economic prosperity for those around them. And we think ultimately that 5 years in is far too early to make a judgment on probably what is going to be the most prosperous economic deal that we have ever seen. We're going to bring you two arguments on team opposition. Firstly, why China is in a uniquely better position than any other actor to benefit the countries in the Belt Road Initiative. And my second speaker is going to talk to you about why this benefits China and thus also benefits the rest of the world. Before that, 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, They tell us this is financed off of risky loans and oftentimes is unwilling to benefit these other countries. 3 responses. Firstly, sure, maybe some of these loans are not assessed to be perfect in like impeccable risk analysis. But note the fact that on both sides that there's an incentive to develop these countries. Because China understands that in order for it to have a proper market for its products, the individuals in that market need to have jobs. They need to be able to afford the products that they want to sell to them, and at the same time they need to have products that they can buy from the countries that they create trade deals with. Note that examples like Sri Lanka or the Gurdwara port in Pakistan may be specific examples where it was strategically important for China to annex these areas. We think the comparative then is that on our side, on their side, China still has these hegemonic and expansionist ideals. But the unfortunate reality is they won't be doing it through the peaceful means that the Belt and Road Initiative forces them to do it through. Secondly, note that the long-term benefits that oftentimes still accrue. It was honestly ridiculous for India to say that these roads are only connecting China with explicitly countries in unilateral fashion. Because when you want to make a connection between Kazakhstan and China, you necessarily need to go through all of rural China that lacks development. You go through all of the bordering nations and you connect all of the countries that oftentimes want to trade with each other but lack the infrastructure to do so. Thirdly, we think that when they lost this point, the point at which they just decided to make their alternative examples like the Asian Development Bank. Banks and development banks that China has equal control over and are just as likely going to have the same malicious intent if that is the picture that they want to paint. So ultimately, note that the comparative on their side is that they get the exact same policies, the economic extortion that they talk about, but without the Belt Road Initiative. I'll explain to you why that uniquely helps on our side. The second point of rebuttal is one on dumping. They tell us they economically rue disaster because they dump into these countries. Know why this is patently false. The first reason is because there's an incentive not to do so. Because China is trying to create economically prosperous areas around them because it also benefits themselves. But secondly, even when it does come to dumping, note the fact that the things that they're dumping are categorically not the industries that these countries are trying to grow. Things like technological dumping are actually oftentimes beneficial. Because at the end of the day, it's not much of a travesty if the individuals of these countries are able to buy cheap products. But importantly, these cheap products are oftentimes the way that they can utilize themselves to develop industry in the future. Things like electronics are able to allow for the entrepreneurship for these countries to actually develop the industries rather than allowing them to succumb to the primary industries that they're currently stuck in. Thirdly, they tell us about this sort of hegemonic goal of China. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we think that this hegemonic goal exceeds far past Belt Road Initiative. It's still likely going to exist. We're going to characterize to you in my substantive why it is so that this hegemonic interest is curbed for the better with the Belt Road Initiative. So then, 3 points to our substantive about why China is in a unique position to benefit these countries. The first thing to note is the context of Western isolationism. That is to say, populist rhetoric and American first rhetoric in all countries across the West has caused a global pullout. That is to say, they're unwilling to engage within these countries because honestly, at the end of the day, it's not politically expedient for them to engage with poor, neutral dictators. We think because of this, oftentimes these countries are in a state of destitution or neglect. Why then does this change? Secondly, China has 5 unique incentives that we say means that they're a better actor than any other comparator. The first one is the context of peaceful rise. That is to say, whilst many Western countries may have built themselves upon war and colonialism, China has always taken a very unique approach that has continued into Xi's non-interventionist principles. That is to say, they focus on things like capital or technological or resource exchange that bolsters their economy without taking militaristic or aggressive stances. The second thing to note is the internal priorities of China. That is to say, there's a lot of class struggle and ethnic struggle within China. Because of this, it prevents them from being able to take very controversial stances, because they can't have excuses for countries like Taiwan or areas like Taiwan or Xinjiang from annexing or leaving the country. These internal struggles make sure that China has to keep itself in check because that is the only way that it ensures stability on the long term. Thirdly, there's a unique trade incentive that exists in China, because China used to be on a model of internal consumption. They produced for their own people, and their people consumed what they had produced. But unfortunately, the transition to a secondary and tertiary industry has oftentimes meant that they have an oversupply and they need to tap into the foreign markets of other countries. That is why China uniquely has an incentive to trade with the countries around them rather than economically exploit them like they talk about. Because China doesn't need resources as much as it needs a market that is able to purchase its products. Fourthly, we think China is uniquely politically flexible. That is to say, it has a track record of being okay with dealing with dictators and authoritarian regimes, because Turkmenistan remains a dictatorship on their side. But on our side, they get to prosper their people, and the development that is crucial to the livelihoods of those people can actually happen. Fifthly, the Belt Road Initiative is a test of soft power. And this becomes extremely important, I'll take to in a second. Because the image of constructing a very constructive economic policy and being a benevolent hegemon is in the interest of both China and Xi. The instance in which Belt and Road is used as an instance of soft power is also the instance to the point at which they're willing to do things like compromising on more moderate deals because they understand they want to protect their image. Sure.
Would you feel a tinge of regret if debt default by a poor country results in loss of control of their ports, oil, and unlimited imports from the creditor?
Here's the thing, right? The comparative on your side is having an economically expansionist China go in and do bilateral economic deals that solely focus on the economics. We would much rather prefer a world where these countries are able to do things like use their political or cultural capital in exchange for the economic benefits that they do reap. What then do we think these benefits look like? Because they often come in a plethora. Things like the 150 million tourists that have been traversing this Belt and Road project. Things like the 4.4 million people who are connected in a technological and cultural exchange. Multilateral and long-term deals between countries that are now possible because the roads exist and you cut down time that transports materials by 50%. You increase the production and the ability for these people to access things that they previously were never able to. Access to consolidated markets like the stock markets in China that people in Azerbaijan never had access to before. But also things like educational importing, how the 130 universities have been built across all 70 of these countries. Ultimately, China is empowering these individuals because these countries never had an alternative. They were unable to aspire to grow at all because they had no way that they could have done so without the Belt and Road Initiative. Standardizing trade and standardizing development helps these countries we're very proud to oppose.
For a side that claimed that China's sole incentives are to ensure the economic development of the most vulnerable countries which the Belt and Road passes through, they didn't engage with what we've seen happen over and over again every time China gains more economic control over a region. Flooding markets in developing countries and destroying local businesses. Seizing ports like the Gadar port in Pakistan, where they literally extracted oil and flooded those markets as well. Seizing the Sri Lankan airport for a period of 99 years. Our first speaker told you what really happens when the great incentives of China to gain economic power translate into the lives of individuals on the ground. We say if it's just one road, it's a dead end. Two things that came out of that last speaker's speech. Firstly, that China is in a uniquely better position to help these host nations, and secondly, a line about how this benefits China and that's good for the rest of the world. Firstly, on this idea that China is in a uniquely better position to help these host nations, a number of responses. Firstly, on the idea that China engages in a peaceful rise to never engage in military aggressions. Great. It's peaceful in that they're not sending their armies in. It's not peaceful in that they're inducing poverty into these regions by crippling structurally disadvantaged countries with massive debt. We think poverty isn't peaceful. We think the suffering of a vast majority of individuals in these countries doesn't count as peaceful. Second, they say China has a unique trade incentive. Yeah, you know what they mean by unique trade incentive? Flooding markets with cheap goods and destroying local businesses, stealing infrastructure from these countries. The things we told you in our first speech, that's what they mean when they tell you unique trade incentive. Don't let them mislead you with their language panel. Thirdly, they say the Belt and Road Initiative is an instance of soft power and therefore China will be willing to compromise on other things. Except, one, if China gains more power, as I'll talk about when I get to the second issue, they're not going to be more able to compromise on other things, no thank you, at the point where they become more powerful. But second, that doesn't engage with the sheer economic devastation that their policy does. What did we say in our speech? We told you that alternatives exist and these alternatives are significantly better for countries on the ground. Firstly, because each of these organizations which are multilateral want their money back, which means they're less likely to be okay with these countries being in crippling debt. Why is China okay with that? Because they can seize those ports, because they can extract natural resources from those areas. The fact that these multilateral organizations aren't exclusively controlled by a single country means they're able, no thank you, to check each other. Lastly, they say the comparatives, China engaging in even worse economic expansion. Firstly, we regret that too, right? On our side, we are not saying that the Belt and Road Initiative is bad, but whatever else horrific thing China might do is good. We are okay with regretting that as well. But second, that concedes that the incentives of China are in pure self-interest, and it is okay with undermining the most vulnerable nations on the planet in order to advance its self-interest. All we are saying is the Belt and Road is an extension of that. We told you that debt default is devastating to these nations. At the point where 8 out of 23 nations in the Belt and Road program are marked with elevated debt risk. We think that's something they never bothered to engage with, and that's devastating for the most vulnerable individuals on the ground. Then on the second idea, this benefits China, that's great for them. First thing to note is that it's bad for the vulnerable individuals within China when China can no longer be held accountable by international actors. This looks like the Uyghur Muslim populations within China. We think that's incredibly problematic. Secondly, thank you. Insofar as right now, as they themselves explain, the US is undergoing a decline and therefore we don't have a concentration of power in particular regions. We don't want there to be more concentration of power. We don't want the US to be replaced by another superpower who can repeat all the atrocities that the US engaged in. That's what we told you in our second argument, that they crowd out, regional powers. When China gets massive control over ports, massive military access to things like military to be able to coerce nations into accepting, the Belt and Road program. We told you that we don't want another country to get the same concentration of power that China once had. If it's just one road, it's a dead end. Moving on to my substantive point. The Belt and Road Initiative is a road to entrenching illiberal regimes. Before moving on, yes.
Your case relies on the assumption that without the Belt Road Initiative, that all of China's incentives also disappear. We think that a comparative on your side is they're much more likely to rely on things like sharp power or extractive bilateral deals rather than the multilateral ones in the BRI.
Two responses to that. Firstly, as I already told you, we regret that too. Let's be clear, this debate is not about what China should do. As China, what would we do in order to advance the populations in the world? This debate is about when presented with that choice 4 years ago, what would have been better for the world? Whether it had gone with the BRI or whether it had gone with multilateral organizations. But secondly, insofar as China wants access to soft power, absent the BRI, not wanting to piss existing global powers off, they're more likely to go into the multilateral organizations we talked about in our first speech. Alright, the Belt and Road Initiative is a road to entrenching illiberal regimes. We've already shown that the economic calculus of the Belt and Road Initiative isn't exactly healthy. But let's take Team China at their best for a moment and assume that it is. The political costs are still devastating because governments are likely to become more corrupt and less accountable as a result of their policy. If economic development is unlikely to ever come to fruition, we don't want illiberal regimes to be more entrenched. That's a significant thing to regret. 3 ways in which the Belt and Road Initiative entrenches illiberal regimes. First, it provides unaccountable leaders access to cheap credit. The Belt and Road Initiative's laws don't place any conditions on political reform of authoritarian countries. That's why they themselves told you, we want money going into these poor dictatorships. One of the biggest incentives for countries to engage in political liberalization right now is the fact that organizations which provide aid and provide infrastructure loans right now place conditions on these illiberal countries to politically liberalize. On their side of the house, they provide these regions access to cheap credit, and there's no cost, to staying authoritarian, to checking your power even more. But secondly, the Belt and Road Initiative has directly strengthened illiberal regimes. Why? Because it is in China's interest for more countries to join the initiative, to accept these loans and to not constantly change their position on them. When a country is a democracy, there's always a risk that a protectionist party wins the next election and ends that cooperation with the Belt and Road. However, a more illiberal regime, on the other hand, is likely to stay in power for a long time and is likely to be able to hold a strong stance on the issue of the Belt and Road. How does China entrench governments which are favorable to the initiative? First, things like oil investments for the exclusive purpose of propping up Omar al-Bashir's Sudan, giving massive foreign donations to finance the LDP in Uzbekistan to win the 2016 election. All of this is so that the countries don't back out of the extensive Belt and Road projects. But thirdly, the regimes right now rely on tax money to sustain themselves, to fund things like infrastructure projects. But in a developing country, it's really hard to enforce a meaningful tax regime. Therefore, they pass policies to ensure things like economic growth, to expand the trust that people have in these governments so that they pay taxes. Now that they have an alternate source of funding, they're less likely to have that incentive. Why is this pernicious? Outside of the fact that it's deeply morally problematic for China to erode democracy, we think strong institutions are critical to the long-term development of these countries. Because an illiberal dictator doesn't really have an incentive to improve conditions of low-income populations on the ground at the point where they are not voting. We think this is a self-perpetuating cycle when international aid organizations also cut these balances out to the point where they are forced to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. On our side, those multinational organizations are more likely to impose standards of democracy and enable the long-term development of these vulnerable countries. If it's just one road, it's a dead end. We're very trusting.
The Silk Road is nothing new, because for 1,000 years, the reason why the Chinese Empire was able to gain prosperity in spite of greater British colonialism was the result of the Silk Road. Once again, Team India has not watched enough sci-fi movies, because its policy is precisely back to the future. 2 questions in this speech. First, are Chinese incentives inherently extortionary? Second, what are the benefits to other nations? And finally, I'm going to bring to you a new substantive argument as to why benefits to China and dodging China away from its own internal politics is beneficial for the world. Before that, just a bit of framing. I'd just like to point out that the Belt and Road Initiative, i.e., opening up your borders and pursuing free trade as a means of economic development, is not mutually exclusive to China as well. India, their nation, has pursued economic liberalization and foreign reform by opening up its borders. The USA and the EU were able to achieve large amounts of economic prosperity precisely because they were able to use free trade agreements to use and get access to foreign markets. But moreover, note that the Belt and Road Initiative was created in 2013 with the framing to say that the large majority of its benefits would actualize in 2042. This is 5 years. We stand against the fear-mongering of the West, and we say that we must watch this, take this in with caution, and look at the trends as to what has happened in the past. First question on extortionary incentives. No, thank you. We told you that the incentives of China were not inherently extortionary. They framed the Belt and Road Initiative as purely on economic means as a result of infrastructure, but didn't engage with any of our analysis as the idea that China has used this as soft power to improve its image. The fact that they've signed more than 300 cooperative deals and action plans and cultural exchanges shows that this is not just for economic means, but also to improve its global image. And we told you that this global image is a moderating factor, that because the Belt and Road Initiative elevates China's economic means and China's image towards Western scrutiny, the scrutiny of Western media, and also the improvement of the image in the eyes of every other Belt and Road Initiative, they have the incentive to improve their image and not be so extortionary on their side of the house. Don't let them get away with the 3 examples of Sri Lanka and Pakistan and South Africa. Because the majority of examples, which I'll go into later, are beneficial towards the people. Their main response was that economic hardship leads to dumping and exploitation of these nations. That's not true, because we told you the context of China, that China's economy used to be based on internal consumption. But as a result of China producing and overproducing goods, we have an oversupply of goods, which means that China's going to sell it anyway. So without the Belt and Road Initiative, you are still going to have China dumping their goods and exploiting local industries. The problem is that there are going to be shady deals and happen behind closed doors. Their only response to this was, we regret China's foreign policy. But you cannot regret China's foreign policy, because without the Belt and Road Initiative, these incentives will exist on either side of the house. The difference is more exploitative on theirs. The next response was the idea of alternatives, that the ADB and BRICS are better. Well, we told you that China precisely has more control over this. But the next response was to say that the AIIB is not multilateral. But that's factually incorrect. The AIIB includes China, but it also includes nations from a wide variety of demographics, like the UK, like Canada, like multiple African nations, and like multiple EU nations as well. For them to say it's multilateral is disingenuous on their side of the house. But moreover, we didn't understand why there was an incentive to create stable markets, because China does want to sell its goods. And it seems intuitive to us that if you do want to sell your goods, you should not unemploy everyone within that nation, because if there's an 100% decrease in wages, regardless of the fact that if goods are cheaper, people cannot afford them. There's an incentive for stability within these nations. The final thing on extortionary incentives was this extension from second prop to say that we perpetuate illiberal regimes and empower them with technology. 2 responses. First of all, note that they didn't engage with the imperative, because these regimes will stay as dictators anyway. Given that they will remain dictatorships, we'd rather benefit the people to create thick middle classes. Because you know what the best way to take down dictatorships is? Is to benefit the people, expose them to liberal ideas as a result of globalization, and to take down that dictatorship, not to leave them in poverty, and only enhance the legitimacy of these dictators. But secondly, note that in supporting dictatorships is not mutually exclusive to China. Western nations do this as well. The US supports Saudi Arabia, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Iran. So unclear to me why China is the only nation that will do this. So these incentives are not inherently extortionary. We think that China provides greater benefits and it provides a moderating factor as well. Secondly, benefits to other nations. I like to point out that they very, very disingenuous examples by only pointing out Sri Lanka and Pakistan. We can see that these are bad examples. But note that this is the beginning of the initiative, and beginnings of initiatives will always be set with hardships. But they neglected the other parts and beneficial initiatives as well. 3 things that they provide. First, energy. China is a leader in green energy and provide things like useful energy grids that provide nations without electricity and without the the grids to power things like basic hospitals and provides them to these nations. That's why Pakistani hospitals finally got power and were not able to be exploited because China provided this energy as well. Secondly, infrastructure. And no, if you want to connect it to China, you also have to connect it to other nations as well. They built railroads in Laos that made transportation within those nations far faster. Thirdly, you facilitate local industries like agriculture. Kazakhstan used to be a nation that could not feed its people because of the winters and the cold season that happened there. That changed on our side of the house when China was able to build a railroad that connected Kazakhstan to Xinjiang and finally gave people food when they inspired better on our side of the house. We think that there are benefits to other nations they cannot neglect by cherry-picking examples. Now to my substantive before I move on. Yes.
If the Belt and Road Initiative was exclusively funded by the US with the exact same conditions, would you support it?
Okay, first of all, we think that the US is unlikely to do that. But secondly, China provides a uniquely good actor, and I want to show that to you in my substantive argument now. Alright, so my argument will prove to you that benefits to China means that you quell internal struggles. Why is this important? This debate is centered around the vulnerability of certain actors and how we can best help minorities and best help vulnerable people around the world. The Belt and Road Initiative has brought and will continue to bring massive benefits towards the Chinese people, and a country with 1.5 billion people should not be ignored. But more importantly, I'm going to prove to you why, because this is good for China, it is good for the West as well. China used to have double-digit economic growth, but that has slowed in recent years. Now economic growth is stagnant, and because the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is contingent on providing economic growth for its people, it is focused on internal struggles and the status quo. What are the benefits to China? 3 things to say to this. Firstly, you help oppressed minorities within China. So you help people like the Uyghurs, the Hui minority, and the Tibetans, who are surveillance and systemically excluded from opportunities on their side of the house. But on our side, you give them jobs in Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan because they are able to speak the language. We finally give these people stable employment. Second, you benefit poor provinces in China because free trade agreements and infrastructure go through provinces like Xinjiang and Yunnan, which otherwise would be isolated from China as well. So you get things like new jobs, which has created $2.5 trillion within industry in China as well. Finally, economic development. So you're able to have greater exports. You're able to create a thick middle class. Why is this important? When you have a productive society and people out of poverty, that's when China is removed from its internal struggles and can focus on bringing aid to external countries. That's what happened with Japan, where after establishing a stable economy, they were able to give a lot of oriental development aid. China is particularly good because they value the peaceful rise to power. They were able to create stable foreign policy in nations and fill a vacuum to the isolationist context that my first speaker gave you. So, because we benefit people and because China does not have extortionary incentives, proud to oppose. Thank you.
They were extremely clever. Side opposition came up here and said, this is a debate in the future, it's about 2042, please don't ask us to give you examples right now. The simple reason is because they know that the 9 most participant countries out of the BRI, 8 of them are in elevated debt risk right now. Laos, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Pakistan, Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, all of these countries right now are suffering under debt because of the BRI. They want to put this into the future, so you might ignore the struggling of the poor right now. But we looked at them right now and realized that when you're stuck in debt, when you're trying to restructure and save your economy, 10 years into the future doesn't look that pretty either. The reason they had no example is because the BRI has no good example. 3 questions in this debate. Firstly, how does this affect developing nations? Secondly, how does this affect the global balance of power? And thirdly, how does this affect the most oppressed? On the first question of does the belt help developing nations? Their main push is, listen, China has an incentive to get their loans back. But we clearly showed to you how it is deliberately planned by China that they don't need to get their loans back. That is, that they can seize the ports and resources that these people have built, when they can actually control the trade flows. When, because of the fact that now they have a railway line running through Kenya, they can literally take the mine equipment that they have, the mine resources that they have, lead them to the train and ship them off straight back to Beijing. These are huge incentives to actually allow these projects to fail. And they are huge because it means that a debt default is not 100% against their interest. Their only response to this is, oh, well, it's in their global image. Here's the thing. If Kenya fails to build a railway, it's Kenya's fault. China can just push it off saying, listen, this is a project with 70 countries. Obviously, there'll be some failures. Like they said, stop cherry-picking examples. It's just a poor developing country. They don't have any harm on their global image. What they do have, however, is a lot of trade and resources now open to them. No thank you. But then after that, they come up and say the alternative is a Western pullout. But is that true? Did they literally do anything other than just say Trump exists, therefore this argument must be true? Because the World Bank has given $60 billion just last year. The IMF, $90 billion. We also see the rise of the BRICS Bank, the ADB, regional lenders like the African Bank. At the end of the day, there are a lot of regional powers who are stepping up and giving up investment. We accept that we don't have as much. However, it's not that all debt is good. We tell you we have more than enough money to actually tend to the most struggling countries on our side. The only response to this is say, well, China's in there, which means they must be evil and try to control them too. But here's the thing, China doesn't control like around 80% of the funding in there. That's where the difference lies, panel. They say the AIIB is multilateral. Here's the thing, other countries exist in the AIIB, but almost all of their voting shares together are still less than China. We told you how the BRICS Bank has a 20% distributed across every single shareholder. That's where it was true. We weren't saying that Germany had great incentives and was wonderful because they were white. We were saying everyone is self-interested and we balance it out by making them act as checks on each other. That's why our alternative of lending was far better. But for what, panel? What benefit were they standing for? The only thing they gave us in their first speech was now it's interconnected. But we told you why that's a horrible thing. Because it means that when you plan your finances such that you need the railways to be interconnected to other countries in order for it to turn a profit, if it's actually not interconnected, if Kenya's railway stops, it means that you start paying more for the railways than you actually get from it. That means because of the fact that it's interconnected, the BRI is uniquely harmful and it hurts these countries more than anything. And then after that, let's get to assuming that these projects get constructed, what does it look like? They say China has an incentive to not flood it. Here's the thing, there's a difference between acting wonderful to an economy and not destroying it 100%. China has an incentive to actually monopolize the economy over there. They speak of cheap products, and we agree, but those cheap products will only exist for a short period of time. After that, they get a monopoly over the markets of Kenya and Nigeria and can start raising up prices. At which point, the milk is not cheap anymore in these extremely poor countries, panel. And as a result, we tell you, they don't need to destroy the economies of these countries in order to hurt the lives of the most vulnerable over there. At the end of the day, the incentives of China, not because they're horrible, but because they're a single actor, are perverse. And we would rather a world where at the end of the day, different actors checked themselves and cared for the developing world in a system that worked. Second clash. Does having all roads leading to China help the balance of power? Panel, they literally accepted this. Their literal first speech was, yes, China will go around annexing a couple of ports and harbors here and there, but that's fine, they'll do it anyway. China will be China. Here's the thing, panel. At the end of the day, the BRI is uniquely harmful. Note what alternative methods of oppression they pushed. Nearly nothing. Bilateral trade agreements. Bilateral trade agreements does not get you unilateral control over the major trading ports all around the world. Something they conceded China will strategically try to do. When China can say, I will not allow the US to trade with the entire of the Asian continent, that is when they have a skewed ability to control the balance of power. No response to that. Furthermore, what are these alternative things China is going to do? Not only did we tell you we regret them as well, but they literally rebut themselves when they say China cares about its global image and so won't be horrible. When they say Xi Jinping built it out of pacifism and actually has that narrative. They themselves in their first speech tell you why the alternative is likely to be cooperating. Because of the global image, they're likely to try to be a leader within the ADB. And we're happy for that to happen because they're a balance over there. Let's impact this out, panel, because it really matters in this debate. Because when you have a superpower who has military stronghold over you, who can scare you into submission into any free trade deal, who can control the way your country works politically and economically, it means people on the ground have no control over their countries. It means that people are hurt in ways that China simply wants them to be. That is not a world where we were willing to support. A world where we gave rise to a superpower. We stand for a world of multilateralism. Yes.
The IMF and the World Bank create conditional loans and impose one-size-fits-all policies that result in economic collapse of nations. Why then would you prefer this to the non-interventionist policies and incentives of China?
Our very first speech had reasons why these conditions are basic bare minimum things you need in order to ensure that the loan gets repaid. Unless Sri Lanka checks their massive public spending, they're never paying back the $68 billion debt that they have to China. They needed to respond to that somewhere in their two speeches if they wanted to make that response and that point of information. Our side is the one with sustainable loans which actually work for countries. On the third clash, does the belt help the most repressed in the world? Quickly, let's deal with their funky argument on benefits to China. In an interesting way, this hurts India. 3 reasons why. Firstly, because we're really scared of China having military control all around us, which means we need to spend a lot, which means money doesn't go into healthcare, which means money doesn't go into education. Also because of border violations we told you about, it hurts our ability to keep our soldiers not dying. Furthermore, on wane, India will have more people than China will after the BRI is over, which means also we're more poor, which means we're more vulnerable. We took that argument at its best, panel. Now let's get on to the actual debate. On the comparative of illiberal regimes. They told you, oh, these will be illiberal all the time. Here's the thing, panel. This is a debate about countries like Philippines, countries like Kenya. It's not true that you're either a dictatorship or Denmark. There are people in the middle who actually can change if you incentivize them to do so. What their side does is literally give them an incentive to become worse. When Duterte sits next to Xi Jinping and gets no condemnation for slaughtering 20,000 people in a war on drugs in his country. That is a world where you incentivize them to go further. Not that they don't benefit the people by giving them loans either, because the loans aren't going to the people if it's truly a strong man who doesn't care. We are the only side that helps the most repressed in society. We are the only side that looked at developing nations, didn't coerce them into harmful deals that would rob them of their resources, and actually allowed them to prosper. We were the only side that maintained a balance of power. If it's a one road, we think it's a dead end.
Based on the analysis coming from Team India, it seems like all countries besides China are run by 3-year-old idiots that will drive their country into the ground with no foresight of whether loans exist. We don't think that was actually the debate, and we think that countries are far more important and far more able to understand the risks associated with the BRI compared to what they said. I have 2 simple questions. Firstly, does the BRI benefit partner countries? And secondly, is the BRI better than alternatives? So first, let's talk about if the BRI is better than alternatives. And we told you that the BRI was uniquely considerate because it drew off evocative cultural symbolism and was extended as a form of soft power. This is exactly why China has been spending millions of dollars promoting BRI stories, promoting BRI outreach, and letting the world know about it, because it precisely is a form of soft power. And because it is a form of soft power cares about publicity far more than extortionary economic deals that happen behind closed doors. That was the comparative of this debate. Their response to this was, well, China always wants to seize maximum power, right? We agree. But in this particular instance, China is far more willing to trade off economic profit with cultural perceived advancement. So without the BRI, China would be likely to negotiate bilateral deals that focus on maximum financial extraction. That's far worse, and that was the comparative they had to deal with. Then they came up in third and had this weird response that countries can negotiate better in bilateral deals. I'm sorry, but I don't think Kenya has very much leveraging power against the country that has the second most GDP in the world and will threaten to get rid of it if they don't agree. We think we need a better response than that. But secondly, we told you that if China is so intent on establishing hegemony, if you don't let them establish it through the BRI, they will establish it through other, far more pernicious forms of sharp power. Their only response was a glib, we regret that too. Yes, we'd like to regret every bad thing in the world that ever happened, including poverty, but it's not what the debate is about. Because without the existence of the BRI, China would be far more likely to pursue these alternatives. We told you that insofar as the BRI exists, it therefore means that China doesn't have to rely on these other means. We think that's far better. Then they said, well, we rebutted ourselves because we said China cares about its publicity. Yes, They care about its publicity, but only insofar as they're dealing with soft power, which is particularly only available on our side of the house. Because sharp power is intrinsically bad to publicity, they don't care about it as much in that instance. This therefore means that without this system of government, any alternative would be China pursuing far more draconian policies on their side of the house. Second, let's talk about whether or not the BRI benefits partner countries. Because we gave you 5 structural reasons as to why China would be better in incentives. They responded to one of them. They responded to the one about how they have earned a uniquely good position. Their response was, poverty isn't really peaceful. I think that's premised on the idea that these countries are already prosperous. We don't think that's the case. Because if you look at countries like Kazakhstan, like Tajikistan, those countries were already in poverty before the BRI came around. It was only after they came in, they connected them to the world, that they were actually able to prosper. But more importantly, we told you about the trade incentives on our side of the house. That because China wants to trade with these countries, it means that they simply gain nothing from bankrupting them and putting people onto unemployment. We told you about how it's a test of soft power. We told you how oftentimes they have internal priorities. We told you about the flexibility of their loans, no response to any of these reasons. But more importantly, there were tangible benefits on our side of the house. And it's not enough for them to say, we had no examples, because we clearly did. We told you about the inter-country trade that could happen on our side of the house because of the roads that link Djibouti to Ethiopia. Because contrary to what they say, you don't need to simply be linked to China for your roads to work. As long as you're linked to nations around you, it still lets you trade with other nations. No response to that. But secondly, we told you that it allows for the integration of economies. What does that mean? It means that even parts that are created in China are assembled in places like Kazakhstan, because these types of countries can coexist and use their competitive advantage. What did they tell us? They told us 2 broad ideas. The first one on dumping and the second one on loans. What did we tell you about dumping? We had 4 responses. Number 1, that China has an incentive to keep industries afloat because you can't buy cheap goods if you're unemployed and have 0 income. But secondly, you enable countries and industries to grow because roads systematically work both ways. And that means that when the country's on their side of the house and compared to where no roads exist, it's far worse. But thirdly, because the products that China dump are categorically different from the products that these countries and industries produce. What does it mean? It means China primarily dumps things like cheap technology, things that these countries generally don't produce. But fourthly, we told you, consumer access is particularly important because when a smartphone is actually accessible for a poor man in a rural community, it means that you can now, for the very first time, allow them to improve their standard of living. No response to any of that. Their only response was, well, first China tries to monopolize and then it raises prices in the long run. Here's the problem. When you raise prices, local industries can now compete again. This means that China, if it raises prices, will make sure that local industries can grow up. No response to that. The second idea we heard was the idea of loans. We have 3 responses. Number 1, if loans are so extortionary, if there are so many clear-cut examples of loans, countries clearly wouldn't voluntarily sign into this type of agreement. The reason why is because countries benefit themselves and they're clearly able to benefit. But secondly, just because you default on loans doesn't mean China benefits, because China clearly still loses millions of dollars on a failed project that they cannot recoup even if they claim a port. But thirdly, let's say defaults exist on both sides of the house. Defaults are far better on our side. Why? Because China is far more lenient under circumstances of default. Because when you default on our side, China will just say, it's okay, we'll just claim this port. On their side, what default happens when you go to multilateral banks is they do things like impose austerity, which is far worse, which hurts citizens the most and means that normal people are hit the most. Before that, sure.
China has a subsidy regime, huge agricultural surpluses, and an oversupply that you spoke of. How is this free competition between Djibouti and China?
We never said it was free competition. The structural incentives mean that if you want other countries to buy your products, those people need the money to buy your products. So if you try to flood their industries and destroy everything they have, they won't be able to purchase your products even if they're cheap. Okay, let's deal with what they said about alternatives, because their only response was multilateral banks are better. We gave you 4 responses to this again. Number 1, we told you that in the context of an isolationalist West and an insular EU, investment would have never come to landlocked countries of Eastern Europe. Secondly, we told you that even in places where multilateral banks were available, that it was simply infeasible, because they impose things like stringent environmental regulations that make projects economically infeasible. Secondly, we think they're far worse. Why? Because they seem to claim that Condition A is far better. Unfortunately, Condition A is a euphemism for structural adjustment. It is a euphemism for austerity that hurts citizens the most and cuts welfare spending. But thirdly, they say it crowds out other people without really explaining the mechanism. Why? That is simply not true. In places like Southeast Asia, Japan still outspends China. In Central Asia, the ADB and the Asian Bank also compete alongside China. And here's where we directly respond to what they said. Because they tell us the World Bank funded millions of dollars. Yes, the vast majority of that funding only occurred after the Belt and Road Initiative. Why? Because on our side, there is now an incentive to compete. Because if you don't give loans out, it's seen as losing the opportunity to gain that land. So what happens now is there's a race to the bottom. People make loans far more accessible. Because on their side of the house, the places they're talking about never get those loans. At the end of the day, what otherwise would have happened to these types of countries is they wouldn't have loans. There would be no incentive to outreach to them, and people would be stuck in the very conditions they were born in, conditions of abject poverty. We provided the ability for people to get out of these areas, and that's why we were proud to oppose.
Panel, I think India's case fell when they misread the motion. Because today's debate was not about everything wrong with China's foreign policy and economic deals around the world. Today's debate was about the Belt and Road Initiative, and that distinction was quite important. Because even on their side, China is expansionist, they want to take over these countries, but they're going to do it through sharp power rather than through soft power and economic deals. The countries on their side are still desperate and impoverished, so instead of doing it through the Belt Road Initiative, which is multilateral, they'll do bilateral deals with China, they'll go to the AIIB by themselves, and they'll end up in the economic destitution that they talk about. Because ultimately, China's incentives were cannot be inflated with the Belt Road Initiative. This was a special project that was created by China to improve their image, one that meant that they had to be modern, because they didn't want to ruin its very own purpose. Economic deals exist on both sides. On our side, they're a little bit better because China cares about its appearance. I'm going to look at this debate through two metrics. Firstly, the countries that are within the BRI, and secondly, China itself. Firstly then, on the countries within the BRI, we explained to you that we uniquely brought you development. Things like roads that can allow for inter-African and inter-Asian trade, tourism, technological, and cultural exchange over 4.4 billion people, access to consolidated markets like stock markets that countries like Azerbaijan would never have on their own, electricity and cheap technology to the people who otherwise are never able to gain access to it because the infant industries within their own countries are never able to develop it. That is why we told you examples like the China-Pakistan corridor can generate $62 billion every year. Importantly then, why were the responses inadequate? Firstly, they told us that some countries default. But sure, that is true. But the comparative on your side is that they default on AIIB loans on themselves, but they don't get the support from China because China doesn't need to rectify their own image. Secondly, they told us that China was extortionist and hegemonic. Problem is, they are too on your side. And importantly, throughout this entire debate, the comparative needed not to rely on the BRI versus the best possible case scenario of any sort of loan from some magical institution that is multilateral and going to give you the best of deals. Because even if we took them at their best case, when we engaged on grounds like the SAPs from the IMF, we told you that the exploded economies of Chile and Greece probably mean that those are not suitable for most countries. Their response was, this is minimum standards. But we think that just laughs in the face of the people who are dying within those economies because they were ruined by even the most best and glorious actors on their side. Then, they told us that dictatorships are going to be perpetuated. But the unfortunate reality is dictators exist on both sides. And this is very simple why. The thought calculus of a dictator goes as such. On one side, I get loans, but no power. On the other side, I get no loans, but I get power. They always choose power, and thus dictatorships existed on both sides. That was why it was extremely pertinent that our side was able to bring the development to actually help the individuals within these countries. And we told you that even when it comes on the metric of dictatorship and democracy, the best way you get democracy is when you can bolster the middle class, one that on their side is impoverished and starving and never gets access to the benefits of the Belt Road Initiative. But ultimately, let's talk about China. Because India may want to paint China black, but we think that there are certain areas that are improved by this policy. Because the discriminated minorities like the Uyghurs in Xinjiang are actually able to get economic improvement because they're utilized within these deals. And note that if you really want to get snarky, right? China has a bigger population than India, so even if you want to get on those terms, we think we outweigh them because we have like 200 million more people. But ultimately, at the end of today's debate, the comparative is this. On our side, China has unique incentives because the Belt Road Initiative is a soft power that they need to retain. It is an image that they have crafted that they want to keep. On their side, that image dissolves, but the economic interests stay the same, and they're likely going to conscript the countries around them and turn them into the destitution that India told us about. Ultimately, their case in itself, because the only alternative or comparative we saw was one that was much more bleak and one that never cared about its reputation, we were very proud to oppose.
It's just strategic annexure. China just wanted that piece of Pakistan, that piece of Sri Lanka, so they took it. The Chinese Empire and its 2000 years of glory have lived through the Silk Road, so we need to empower the Chinese Empire again. For some reason, this is the case that side opposition brought, while simultaneously they accused us of being scaremongering, accused us of saying that China was malicious and of being xenophobic in the way the West has been. We don't understand. If it is true that these are the kinds of intents that China has, that this is the self-interest that they pursue, why then will they be celebrating the OBOR? Because throughout this debate, they conceded when they arrived at the start, that it is something that intrinsically can be regretted, just wanted to push for the comparative. We'll talk about that later, but what they did concede was the One Belt, One Road to the vulnerable nation is a highway to hell. Two questions then. First, let's talk about balance of power, and second, whether then it actually helps developing nations. Balance of power. I'll give you a lot of nuanced material across the bench here. Right? First, we say that when you have an immense amount of debt, the trillions of debt that China pushes these nations into, that it has control over these nations. That it takes away ports in general regions and gets to hold the entire world hostage when it says if you want to trade in South Asia and the Indian Ocean, you have to go through us. That it mobilizes its military instantaneously if it wants to scare nations into listening to it. That this often happens in disputed territories. The reason why their lack of response to this argument was so alarming is because even if we concede all the harms and benefits, this is how the comparative comes out. Because if this is a debate about the kinds of incursion that China will continue to have on either side, we don't understand why that's something that's unique on their side of the house. Because their ideas were generic, that China wants that region, that it wants to claim that empire. But on the other hand, what they actually did was to empower China to unleash his incursion upon the entire world. When they could hold nations in Africa and Europe subject to their debt. When they could violate their sovereignty. When it internationally hastened this destruction by putting the entire world at the subject of China. So if they wanted to talk about the comparative, their side was a side that hastened the kind of destruction in the very, very worst case. Then they brought out lots of new material in third opposition, right? When they tell you that there's going to be a race to the bottom because otherwise conditional aid is bad, now it gets better. What they fail to recognize is the comparative is a world where different actors check each other. The United States holds debt in Chinese money and therefore checks China, and China is actively participating in international institutions. It is Xi Jinping's legacy to make China modern like they say. And at the same time, regional powers hold all of these actors accountable. Therefore, it wasn't as simplistic a debate as side opposition wanted to push to. But their conception of this debate was very simple. They said there isn't money, so we need money. What they didn't realize is that bad debt is worse than no debt at all. That the kinds of crippling effects that come with default when your ports are stripped away and you're left with long-term poverty is far more worse. What did Team China concede, right? They concede the self-interest. They concede that China empowers dictators, right? But they don't respond to our second speaker's material or how they target dictators, profit from the sustenance of dictators. And how the comparative is one where strongmen can be liberalized by holding them accountable using aid as a leverage. They concede that the OBOR has failed so far and that Kenya doesn't have power against China. They just say alternatives are worse with no clarification of what these alternatives are or why they will happen. Let's look at the alternative of war. They say China has an incentive for peace, but apparently there will be war. Incentive for internal struggles being reduced, but apparently war reduces internal struggles. Global image, but apparently that's good in war. There's an internal surplus, but apparently that's also good in a world with war. If they wanted to talk about bilateral ties, they failed to realize that this is a question of do we want bilateral aid, do we want multilateral aid, or do we want debt? Even if this debate is about China, by 2042, India will have a data population. If it's just one road, it's a dead end, we think that we need to loosen the belt.